Okay. Oh, okay. So we messed up and I hit the wrong button. I hit the end button uh, instead of the leave button. So if you guys are able to see this, then fantastic. You are so much better than my normal audience, which would just say, screw it. He's not going to do anything and walk away.
Take two.
Take two. Mike is still wearing the outfit that he was wearing when I messed it up the first time around. We will
Except
avoid.
pants. I took my pants off,
Yeah.
but you can't tell because we're on a Zoom.
Yeah. Well, you had to keep yourself from sliding.
I did.
Yeah.
I kept falling off.
The silk underwear probably isn't helping much. Hey, we got most everybody back. This is fantastic. Thank you so much for actually watching this. I will avoid hitting the end stream button this time, and we can continue going. All right. Sweet. Okay. Okay. So, Mike, you were talking about a question that we were going to answer before I so rudely just killed the stream for no good reason.
Yeah. So I get this question a lot because of my background as both a contractor and a manufacturer rep. I spend a lot of time in code, and code is very nice because it doesn't care who's paying the bill, whether it's a insurance company or insurance carrier that's ultimately going to be reimbursing for a covered loss, or if it's a retail situation where the homeowner is paying out of their pocket. The contractor is still obligated to perform the duties per code. Per code.
Okay.
Now the question becomes when in doing an insurance work, at what point should a contractor specifically assume that there is coverage under the policy? Now the biggest confusion is obviously, is it covered under Schedule A, or do they need code upgrade coverage, or all these different words that carriers like to use and throw into the mix, confusing the entire situation, or is it ordinance and law? So let me tell you first and where I'm coming from, and then I'll ask you, because I think what contractors typically do is go, code is law. Oh, ordinance and law includes the word law. So if it's code related, you need ordinance and law. So Remington, I'd like to ask you that question. What is, if you can give an overview of minimum code compliance as compared to ordinance and law coverage within a policy?
I can say this is the major key to ordinance or law, which a lot of people that are starting in this industry don't understand, that it's cost incurred. Once incurred, it's paid by the carrier. And I think your question is tailored towards a contractor knowing if there's coverage. I think that's something to the effect that you're asking. Here's my suggestion is you don't do the work until you figure that out. You know, although that there's, you know, because the insurance carrier is going to come out with some type of estimate, RCV, ACV evaluation. Within that estimate, they should indicate if there's ordinance or law coverage or not, and how much is allocated for the ordinance or law once it's incurred. So to me, I think that's the best way to dip your toes in it without getting in trouble, because you don't want to promise a homeowner or commercial building owner that they're just going to pay their deductible and everything's going to be smooth sailing, because you find out they don't have O&L. You're in trouble. And so that's, I just say, be cautious, but that's, again, the attorney side of things. I know, Mike, you probably figured out different ways to not necessarily be as cautious, like entering into the situation.
Yeah. So that's really good advice, because people go into these things and they promise way too much. I've honestly had contractors promise that if I'm not able to overcome or make a claim actually get paid, that they will just pay for the roof themselves. Like the contractor, like guaranteed a roof to people with my services as a public adjuster. Luckily, in all the 3 times that occurred, I was able to actually win. But my God, what if I didn't? So good. Have caution. I like that strategy. Now, as far as ordinance and law goes versus coverage A, there are some differences and there are some overlaps, and that's why it's confusing. Because you're right, it does have the word law in it. An ordinance and law, building code coverage, code upgrade coverage, law and ordinance, these are all the same thing generally, but they are slightly different from one policy to the next. So we're going to talk about very generalized things. And it's different from a residential policy to a commercial policy. We're going to talk about residential. So a residential policy, very generalized, and this can be different from one state to the next. So very generalized. This is my disclaimer. Ordinance and law is supposed to cover you when there is an increased cost caused by an enforcement of an ordinance or law. And what the hell does that mean?
Exactly.
So what is an increased cost? And feel free to jump in at any point in any of this, Remington, if you have anything to add to it or if I'm wrong. So from what I can gather, an increased cost would be anything that is outside your normal course of construction.
That's huge.
That's a big deal. But there's a second caveat, or it's something that isn't currently on the roof. So if you're talking about a roof claim and it's not there, then it would be an increased cost to add it on. So you're increasing from a certain point, and that point that you're increasing from is the RCV coverage. Or if it's ACV value, you still calculate RCV first, and then you depreciate it, so it still starts at RCV. So what is the replacement cost value of the roof? In a policy, replacement cost value is how much it would cost to replace with like kind and quality of what's currently there. So if there's no drip edge on the house, and drip edge is required by law, then when I remove the nothing, what is like kind and quality of nothing? Nothing. So there's no value to it whatsoever. So there's a zero replacement cost value. If I install drip edge now, it's not part of replacement cost value because it wasn't currently there. So that's an increased cost over replacement cost value. If I'm forced to do something completely outside the ordinary course of construction, say I'm replacing a roof and they are requiring you to upgrade the amount of insulation in the attic at the same time in that county, that is outside the normal course of construction. That might require ordinance of law. That's an increased cost over your normal course of construction. So it's either increased cost over RCV because it doesn't currently exist on the roof, or it's an increased cost over RCV because they're making you do something that you normally wouldn't have to do. So those are the questions. Is it there? Do you have to do it? And if it's one of those two things, then generally speaking, coverage A covers it, because coverage A also covers compliance with code. So that's the overlap. A lot of the ordinance and law stuff covers compliance with code or covers the increased cost. But coverage A always covers compliance and then excludes the increased cost. So there's an overlap. And that's where all that confusion occurs.
Mm-hmm. And lots of fun.
Yes.
So let's go over a couple of scenarios, and then you tell me which bucket you find it in.
Okay.
So I live in Minnesota, just north and west of the Twin Cities. We have a house that was built. The last time it was re-roofed was prior to 2000. There was no ice and water shield on the house at the time. So house gets hailed on. You've got a 1999, let's say. So the roof is now 24 years old. Hail. Now, when they tear it off, obviously there's no ice and water shield on there, but clearly for the last 12, 15 years, ice and water shield is now required 24 inches inside the heated wall and around all penetrations. So roof is torn off, replaced. Insurance carrier comes out and says what? We don't owe for it because it's a code increase. There was nothing there before.
Right.
Now there is.
That's where the term code upgrade came from. You're upgrading them to current code that wasn't there before, and that's why you're installing something new. That's where the
code upgrade goes. Now there are some that say, how do you upgrade the code? The upgrade is the minimum. So it's not like you upgrade. You're sitting down at a restaurant, you're upgrading to a glass of water. I mean,
but you're upgrading to the new current code. So when it was built originally, it was built to code, and now a new code has come out where something new is now required, and now you're upgrading to that with the new roof.
So the question on the table is it reasonable on an typical RCV homeowner policy for that cost of the leak barrier 24 inches inside the heated wall, because that is the minimum standard in the state of Minnesota? Is it reasonable to assume that there is coverage within the policy for that cost?
I'm gonna let you have that one, Remington.
I would say it's reasonably assumed, yes. However, here, I think here's the key. Number one, do they have ordinance or law coverage? Check, yes or no. Number two, there's a lot of policies that are specific that say we will pay for the damages to, or excuse me, we will pay for the undamaged portion, of particular losses. In this instance, there was no ice and water shield itself. I feel like you would consider it an upgrade. And the reason why I would say upgrade is because it wasn't there prior to the loss. So it's an addition to what was actually at the structure at the time of the loss. I would assume, yes, it's covered.
Yeah. So that's the key, though. If they don't have ordinance and law, then there might not be coverages there. So I don't know. There are some states that require ordinance and law be on every policy. I don't know if Minnesota is one of those.
So Minnesota is the one. So Minnesota under statute 65A is required. And I want to go to Jared's question next, because I thought that was going to be an easier one than it was. So normally, when we're doing claims in Minnesota, I mean, that's typically that is a covered loss.
Minnesota has it.
Yeah.
It's required by the state. Even if they don't even have it on their policy in Minnesota, they have it because it is a state statute that they have it. So even if you don't find it and you happen to be in that state, that's the way that state works. And there are other states like that. And sometimes there is a state minimum percentage of your coverage A value for a limitation. And I want to get to code limitations, actually.
Yeah.
Because you might exceed those on certain things. So some states like Florida, unless it's surplus lines or they have specifically signed off on not having it, they have a 25% minimum requirement. States like Georgia, there's no requirement at all for any of them. Almost every policy used to have it. When I started as a PA, you could almost assume that they had a 10% ordinance and law on every policy. And now you can assume that they don't have it because no one is offering it to them when they get a new policy because it increases.
So I want to know, Mike, what is the answer?
What? Well, so, but I see that's the thing.
Assume if there's coverage for it or not. What's going on?
Yeah. So in my experience, but again, my experience is relegated to Minnesota. It absolutely is every 100% of the time. And as I understand it, I mean, there's a lot of different ways I can go with this. Like, my mind right now is going in like 10 different directions. But like, yeah, I mean, if the roofing assembly is damaged, see, this is where I think we always get into trouble because we go, oh, the shingles are damaged. So now how much of the parts and pieces of that do we replace? And we start getting lost in the weeds. The fact is, this is property insurance. The property was damaged. Of the property, the roofing assembly was damaged. What does it cost for me to replace or repair the roofing assembly? Well, guess what's part of the assembly? It's stated in Chapter 9 of the IRC, very specifically, the deck, the roof covering, the underlayments, like that is the roofing assembly. So if the roofing assembly is damaged, then there should be coverage under coverage A for that work. The problem that starts getting weird is when there's meter mass. I always use meter mass as one. So a lot of times in Minnesota, the power lines are coming in through the rooftop, and there's city ordinances or laws that say nope, we need to bury those anytime there's a re-roof. Well, now you need additional coverage. That's the ordinance and law portion of it. That okay, there's something that outside of code or a minimum compliance type of a situation that now kicks in, and you need additional coverage.
Jared, we're going to come back to your question in just a second because as simple as that question was, there's complexity to it as well because you're talking about ice and water shield. If we were talking about ice and water shield in the valley versus ice and water shield on the eaves, that could change our answer because underlayment was required when it was originally installed. It was probably 2 layers of felt in the valley was probably required. And now ice and water might be required or metal, or 2 layers of felt might still be allowed. But if you don't have that, that was originally required when you installed it. If your roof was not up to code at the time it was installed, then they wouldn't necessarily owe for it to be to that original code because it still doesn't have the proper RCV value. You still have to replace with like kind of quality of what's there. So in case that fixed some confusion for some of you, I probably just made more of you confused than you were. Actually, I kind of confused myself even. All right, so let's talk about the decking.
Okay, let's talk about decking.
This is the big one.
This is the big one, but I think this should be the easiest one. In my estimation, this got to be the
It's
easiest one.
not.
And I understand that. Okay, so I think some of the complexity is that we can't see the decking before unless you poke yourself in the attic, and then even then that you can see
Fine.
everything.
You are required to get down to the deck as part of a normal roof related job, right? In order to identify if the deck is suitable for new roofing materials to be installed on.
Yeah.
That's part of the job. Okay.
So let's say that you're tearing off a roof and it's got space decking, and there is
What do you mean by
greater.
space
So
decking?
it's lumber decking per
Okay.
what our
just making
803.1. So you're looking at the table at our 803.1, which is not the same as 503.2.1.1.1 parentheses, which
None
is
of us
the
actually know all the numbers
Well,
you're saying. You could be completely wrong,
the
and we're just going to let it fly.
we're gonna let it fly.
because
No,
you're
this
saying
is
it with
it's one of the
such
most
confidence.
well, it's one of the most common questions that we get on the code question. But so there's
Yeah.
a table in the 500 section that you have to refer to when talking about OSB and plywood.
Right.
And
the
then
flooring table.
803.1 is about lumber decking. So let's
Right.
talk specifically about lumber decking.
Right.
If
5/8
if
minimum.
it's exactly a 1/4 of an inch gap, you can still double underlayment, and it still works according to the manufacturers. Because now, as soon as it exceeds a 1/4 of an inch, now
Yeah.
you need a suitable substrate.
So
per
what is required to happen at that point?
So what's required to happen is that, well, code's going to say needs to be a suitable substrate. They don't tell you what that is. Then it
They don't
throws
tell you exactly what to do.
Yeah. So now it throws it over to the manufacturers, who then say 1/4 inch minimum.
Yeah.
Which 1/4 inches just means that's what holds a roofing nail. So don't
Right.
pretend like that has anything to do with span ratings. That's just what holds a nail. So you got a 1/4 inch minimum, which then throws it back to 503, which is your OSB and plywood.
It doesn't have to. It
Well,
just
if
means
you're-
that you'd have to
if you're
take that piece of lumber out, put a
switching it-
slightly bigger one back in, right?
Yeah, right.
And
I
that's
suppose
what a
you could do that.
policy pays for.
Okay. Ooh,
Because that's
expensive.
like kind and quality. So that's part of our CV because it's what's there. Now, once you start talking about other materials that aren't there, when you're getting into the flooring table, whatever 503.
503.2.1.1.
What is
parentheses
it?
1.
What is it in IBC?
I don't.
Okay.
follow it.
I stumped it. All right, so
I don't know.
So
about
if you're getting
IBC.
into OSB or plywood sheathing, then you're adding something that's different, and there's going to be a difference in cost between that. So now you might have to have ordinance and law covered. But if there is damage to, if it's not damage, if it's just that there's gaps because the wood shrinks over time, it's not that it was installed incorrectly necessarily. It just has gaps now. It's not a suitable substrate. What the policy should pay for is to remove that piece of wood and put a slightly wider piece of wood in. You might have to hand cut it because these are 1-bys. Or remove that piece of wood and everything above it and shift everything down slightly and they'll reinstall it all. Detach and reset all that is very expensive. Is it cheaper to replace the roof with plywood or OSB than to piecemeal slightly wider boards all throughout the roof? That's what matters to the carriers. Yeah. It's a numbers game to them. What is going to be the cheapest option? They will repair or replace whichever is cheaper. So if OSB as a replacement is the cheapest option and you show that to them and say, hey, we could do it this way, which is, as far as I understand, is the way you're supposed to do it for the policy. But I've talked to the policyholder and they're completely okay with us switching over to OSB and it would only cost this much. And so you tell me what I'm supposed to do. And they'll pick the OSB if it's a cheaper option, obviously. But by giving them a choice like that, they're more likely to actually say, okay. If you say, I have to replace with OSB or the whole thing, that's not how the policies work. This is going to have to be a compromise, kind of an agreement between the two of you because you're changing the materials. So what the policy pays for is to fill that gap with some wood. And then there's a minimum width requirement for lumber sheathing. So you'd have to really just go back with slightly wider wood. Unless it's already 6 inches, then you can't go wider.
Yeah. Now, anyway. So, but at the end of the day, though, I think the important thing is to continue to say we never left coverage A in that discussion.
We did not. Now, where we might is when we're adding materials that weren't there. So if you're talking about an overlay, that's stuff that wasn't there before.
Yeah.
So if you're putting OSB or plywood on top of the lumber sheathing, which probably isn't the best idea because they're warped,
And you're also
adding weight.
and you're also running into the the length of the nail, because the nail has to penetrate an OSB or a plywood, has to go at least an inch into lumber decking. If you've got 2 layers to go through there, what length fastener are you going to use to be code compliant? So you're creating a whole other set of issues, which, again, that's where I'm always, and you'll notice in my group, I always push this to engage the code official, ask the code official, and let them be part of it, because now you're not arguing code with an adjuster. You're actually saying, I talked code with a code official and I have a answer from him or her.
Yeah. I mean, that's the code official is your best friend in all these things. Hopefully they're a decent code official, because they can resolve a lot of these questions. Now, if you're in a state where ordinance and law is required, getting a code official involved might be saying that we're getting a code official involved to enforce something. And then that word enforcement comes into play, and they're trying to say it has to be under ordinance and law. So if you're to say that doesn't have ordinance and law as a requirement and the policy doesn't have it, then talking to a code official could cause you some issues. So it's all in the way that you talk to the code official. This is what's currently on the roof. Is it okay for it to stay that way? Do I have to change it to something else? If that something else costs more, then the difference in price is what the increase cost is. If I go to plywood over lumber sheathing, and lumber sheathing costs $10 a square foot, and plywood costs $12 a square foot, then there's a $2 a square foot difference. That's the increased cost that would fall under ordinance and law. The $10 a square foot would still be covered under coverage A. So it wouldn't be the full cost of it anyway. Now here's where everyone gets in trouble. There's something called concurrent causation. And there's anti-concurrent causation clauses. And if you have anti-concurrent causation clauses tied to wear and tear or rot, and the reason that you're trying to replace the decking is because of that, then it might not be covered. And you might need ordinance and law to pick it up, because ordinance and law is an additional coverage that can take the place of missing coverage in coverage A. That exclusion will only apply to coverage A. It doesn't apply to the additional coverages unless the additional coverage specifies unless otherwise excluded in this policy. And a lot of times it doesn't say that. So you probably are going to have a policy argument with that. And you probably need a PA involved, but it gets complex. And to be frank, most PAs don't know how to read that properly to know how to interpret it anyway. So most of the time when you've got rot, you're going to have a big fight that probably isn't worth it unless the whole roof is rotten.
Yeah, but you might be able to save yourself a lot of time and effort and heartache. You don't call it rot, you call it a non-suitable substrate, because now you're staying within the bounds of
it's part of the normal course of construction to evaluate.
Yep. So you're staying inside of code. You're using code words, using code conversation with the building official, and you're probably staying within coverage A. As soon as you call it rot, now you're dealing with issues of, now you've got a separate date of loss or whatever you want to call it. It just calls into a whole bunch of questions. So as soon as you start saying words like that, you just increase your fight quite a bit.
Remington, what's the deal with rot, man?
Don't say mold. Don't say rot.
Yeah.
No,
I'm
I'm with you. What is crazy, I thought about, this is where I think you could use the data discovery. You said rot is, hey, there's some policies where if there is an active leak, but it's hidden behind a wall, it's covered. Like when did that data loss occur?
Yeah, it's unknowable.
But anyway, what's that?
That would be an unknowable date of loss. That would be one of those times where you're actually supposed to use a date of discovery.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But to go off what Mike said, I agree. Kind of stay away from the rot, unnailable surface. Let's keep it in that lane versus potentially other things that
I'll
are.
tell you a quick story. Within the there was a case, a court case that was just tried in the state of Minnesota about this surrounding issue, and it did end up being because of the storm damage. Damage got some a wall, an interior wall damage, but in order to repair that wall, it needed a significant amount of rebuild to be done to code. Now, the way the case law ended up, they lost. The building owners lost, the policyholder lost, and that was not covered. But in the case, the decking also needed to be brought to code, and State Farm actually acknowledged that within
Was
the
this a
final.
Texas case?
No, this was Minnesota. This was just tried this year, but they said clearly, there was loss to the roofing assembly. The decking is part of the assembly. Clearly, we owe for the decking, so they paid for the redeck, but they did not pay for the rebuilding of this parapet wall inside. That was due to, there wasn't direct loss to that wall. It was to the.
That sounds like a bad attorney. If
Yes.
they had made the argument about it
Possibly.
being a system,
Yeah.
the simple argument, which would have had to have been brought up before it got to that point,
It was a tough loss.
calling it a system would probably have resolved that. And there are a lot of cases where bad verdict, and it's because the argument wasn't made correctly. And based on the argument that was made, a judge had to make a verdict and couldn't bring in some other argument that the judge deems necessary.
Yeah.
So they can only use what's there. And we're not lawyers, and we're talking about lawyer shit, and Remington's all silent. So,
But I want you to hear, I want everybody to hear that, because every one of you is probably dealing with a State Farm case where they're denying coverage on the decking, redecking situation. And in that case law at the Supreme Court, in which they were basically a winner in that case, they acknowledged inside of that, yep, the decking needed to be brought to code. The decking is part of the roofing assembly. We owe for the decking. And then, there was a complete acknowledgement for that portion of the case.
how does case law work, Remington?
Case law works where one particular jurisdiction, state, I say jurisdiction because if it's federal law, there's different circuits that pay attention to law in each state. For instance, Georgia, Alabama, Florida is 11th. But what it works is that it's supposed to be binding law. Like, these justices came up with this decision, whether it's at the Court of Appeals, whether it's at the Supreme Court of that particular state or jurisdiction. They rule one way, and all the other justices in that jurisdiction are supposed to follow that particular law. And if it's outside that state, you could call it persuasive law. Or if it's in a different state where it's completely different, as in, for instance, Alabama and California, you wouldn't even call it persuasive law. You just, so there's different structures, there's different layers of case law. But like I said,
How does a roofer use it?
How does a roofer use case law?
Yeah.
I'm sure there's instances out there where you could come up with a reason why, but I would say stay away from using case law.
That's touchy. Even for PAs, that's kind of touchy. As a PA, I have sent Merlin Law Blog articles about stuff to adjusters. That way it's not my opinion, it's Merlin's opinion of something. But even that's really towing the line sometimes. So yeah, I don't know how to use that, even though it's great. Like,
it's hard enough to get a handle on code, minimum code.
Yeah.
I don't know if I want a lot of contractors diving into case law.
probably hard to deal with.
Yeah.
So case law is one of those things. So how do you keep up with case law though? How does anyone keep up with it?
Yeah, you got to keep doing searches constantly. We all have these platforms that cost us a lot of money to keep up with that. So anytime there's a new change, we get a notification and we put it in our little case law bank, so to speak. But it's, every attorney learns as they go, all right, well, this is the new case law. Okay, well, here's a new statute, whatever it might be. But what usually happens is a statute comes out and then there's 10 years of case law to define that statute. That's what a lot of that happens. So Bob Hall said, adjusters will say the city don't enforce that code, so we're not paying for it. I think this goes back on what Mike said. You got to get the code enforcement out and say they actually enforce it. Have that in writing. A lot of clients, I've had them do it myself. I know, Matt, you have as well. And Mike, I can guarantee you have as well. you get it in writing that it must be enforced. So just like case
typically, typically it's already in writing. That's where the reason why I want to address this is get to know and love Chapter 1 of the IRC. That's going to have everything that has everything to do with the enforcement and administration of the code, and it will say right in there where it is and is not enforced. And you'll have everything you need out of there.
So here's the funny thing about the word enforcement. There's ambiguity in insurance policy. If you didn't know that yet, oh my God, I just blew your mind. Ambiguity in policies exists. The word enforcement is one of those terms that can be construed in multiple ways. Enforcement could be construed as an action. There is a specific enforcement being done on your claim that is forcing you to do something completely outside the normal. And that's the way it was actually intended to be read in this policy. But they've construed it to be anything that the building official requires a permit for or is going to investigate. And so you got building officials that say, we don't enforce that. And what the building official means is something different than what the policy might mean because they're using different jargon. And so for a building official to say, we don't enforce the decking, I don't care if you put cardboard on it. The code book clearly states that they enforce all the codes that are there. But the code book is using the word differently than the way the building official is using it because the building official is using common vernacular to mean that he's not going to actually go out there and do anything.
He's just saying he's not a police officer.
Right. So what does it mean to have an enforcement? There are cases that I've seen in Texas where it very clearly identifies, the courts have identified that a specific enforcement was never imposed on that particular address, meaning an action, meaning they have put an enforcement on this address to replace all the electrical components because there was electrical mass involved and it has to be under the ground now. It is outside the normal course of roofing construction. It is something that is not normal and it's being enforced on that thing for whatever reason. That is an enforcement as an action, and that's the way it's supposed to be intended. But worst case scenario, if they're going to say that it has to be something that is related to a building code official actually investigating, the word enforcement can be construed as anything that would have a looming threat of punishment. If you could get in trouble for doing it wrong as a contractor down the road, even if they don't enforce it right now, the way that they're using that word, if later on the homeowner tries to sell the house and they have an investigation or an inspection and the inspector says that they didn't do the roof right, and then the building official is notified and sends you a bill, a misdemeanor fee,
usually accrued daily, by the way.
Daily. And sometimes the policyholder also gets the same thing. Then that is a looming threat of punishment. There is a threat that you might get a ticket down the road. And so you could construe the word enforcement to mean so many different things. The carriers are going to construe it the way that benefits them the most. And that's not appropriate.
So one of the tricks that I want to make sure that you guys, it's not even a trick. Like it's literally knowing the code. So R104.1 is called modifications of code. This is where if there's an impractical the code creates an impractical situation, then the building official can give the contractor a modification to code, but they have to provide that in writing. So one of the things that I'm really trying to help contractors understand is that when you're given a scope from a carrier and you're understanding that that is going to be a violation of certain 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 codes, whatever it is, be thorough, right? Figure out what that is. What you're doing is you're packaging that together. You're presenting it to the code official because they don't know manufacturer, what is approved and specifically brought out by manufacturers in these situations. So you bring this to them and say, here's my scope. It's going to be violating this section, this manufacturer specification and installation requirement. I need a modification of code to do this, or you need to deny this. And that action has to be done in writing. So really what you're looking at, and this is where you kind of pull this back.
When you say modification code, do you mean something like almost like a prescriptive method or an alternative repair kind of a deal? Would those do the same thing?
So those are all specifically in that 103, 104 section of code is talking about what happens if you run into these situations that are outside the specs, what are outside of specifically what's inside in code. And there's a section called modification code. So this is why I bring this up, because there's a lot of people that go, well, wait a second, if I tried to pull a permit and I know that it violates code, I'm going to ask them for a variance, or I'm going to ask them to deny my permit. So I'm going, paying my $150, whatever, for a permit and asking them to deny it. To me, you're talking a different language. That's not that there's no prescription for that procedure within code. What is prescribed within code is saying, here is what I want to do. Line item it through what the carrier is asking, what the adjuster is telling you, and say, this is going to violate these certain codes, but I need a modification of code per 104.1, which requires a judgment, or the feedback from has to be in writing from the code official. That's enacted within the pages of the IRC. So when you're doing it that way, and now again, you're not going to have a code official anywhere that's going to say, oh no, I don't care what the manufacturer says, you can do it that way. I agree with the adjuster is right on the section, right? So again, this is how you enact and engage with a code official.
Really, really.
You're asking for a modification of code, which is literally spelled out within the administration section of code.
What I've learned, there's always exceptions to a rule. There typically is. So I think that's what you're getting to, Mike, is that, hey, look, here's the code enforcement. Here's the rule, so to speak. But if there needs to be an exception for specific circumstances, you ask for it, and they'll say, all right, well, you can do it this way. Like you said, get it in writing as well.
So I want to address this one too. Manufacturer requirements are also considered code, and that I'm going to say is actually not true. Requirement doesn't show up anywhere in code. Manufacturer, what is published or approved, is considered code. So we keep interjecting these words that aren't actually there and thinking that they are. It has nothing to do with whether it's required or not. It's actually more considered, is there an alternative or not? So if it's approved by the manufacturer or it's published by the manufacturer, then it's considered code. The word requirement never shows up inside of the pages of the IRC. So if there's an alternative, so let's use an alternative, for example, right? Say it's a 212 pitch. Can you put shingles on a 212 pitch? Yes, but what? You need to have ice and water shield on the entire deck, or double underlayments through the deck. So those are your two ways. So now you've got leeway. You can either go this way or that way. But if there's no, if they say you don't need starter, okay, well, show me, because I've got all of this documentation where the manufacturer clearly states this is the instruction and this is the installation instruction. You're going to have to find something somewhere that says it's not, you don't have to, and you're not going to find it anymore. So it's published and approved are the words that are used inside of code. Requirement never.
When they talk about approved, the approved word in the commentary is approved by the building officials, which is interesting. Not approved by the carrier. It actually.
Oh, right. Yeah. I want to make sure that, that has nothing to do with approved. It's published or approved by the manufacturer.
No, so it's actually in the commentary of the code. I'm teaching you something.
Nice. Yeah.
In the commentary of the code, whenever it says approved, they mean by the building official.
By the building official.
So, and what they mean by that is if there is a variance, if there is some kind of a different prescribed method or something outside the norm from the manufacturer than or a different kind of roofing where you're using freaking license plates or something as shingles, then it would have to be something that is approved. You'd have to get your methodology approved. Your instructions on how to install this have to be approved by the code official. The manufacturers get these approved as a whole by the IRC anyway. So it would be approved by the code official if it's a manufacturer installation requirement.
Yeah. And your CCLI reports are the other ones that talk to about published and approved. Yeah. So those verbiage also show up in those context as well.
Yeah. So is it considered part of code? I think that's
published and approved. But again, what I saw, again, that's 13 years as a manufacturer rep, I kept hearing these requests. I need GAF to say it's required. And I said, no, you don't. It's not in code. It doesn't. Code does not say that the verbiage must reflect it has to have the word required in it. That's not in there at all. That's something that's made up.
Now, the idea though is that you're supposed to follow whichever is stricter, right? So if the manufacturer installation requirements are stricter than what the code says, then the manufacturer installation requirements are what you're supposed to follow.
Yeah. For example, that's a cricket behind a chimney, right? So the code is going to say 30 inches. Right. The manufacturer is going to say 24 inches or anything steeper than a 612 or in a northern state, and then they draw a map.
Manufacturers say 24 inches.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's in the Profile guide.
Oh, my God.
Or anything over an 612. So if you're in Florida and you have a 612 pitch or above, you still need a cricket.
Oh,
see,
I didn't know that.
So
I have left money on the table on many claims.
This is BEI stuff. So can we say BEI is going to be the place for all of this information? We're working on courses to fill all this up.
BEI, by the way, is the Building Experts Institute. It's a school that I'm one of the owners of, and Mike is going to be doing a whole class, probably a very long one,
all of this stuff
on all the building code related things. We've only got time for a few more questions. I wanted to get to this one because I get it a lot myself. And the question from Jared Belcher is, if there's 4 to 5 roofs installed on the same decking, does the decking need to be replaced? Well, I don't know. That's the answer. The question it stems from the idea, is it going to be a proper nailing surface anymore? If you're putting the same type of material onto the decking and you replace it with the same kind of material, then the nails are going to be roughly in the same place. You're going to have a whole bunch of perforations in the decking in roughly the same general area. How many roofs does it take before that decking is too weak to hold the shingles on and still meet the wind resistance requirements? And the answer is, I don't know. But I can tell you this. There hasn't been any actual real studies on it to be able to say. The only way to really know on a per claim basis would be to do a pull test of the nails on site on that roof and compare that to what the pull test requirements are for a new roof. I have re-roofed a sheet of OSB for a class that I did at the National Claims Institute 5 times, and I did the same thing with plywood. And the nails in the OSB suddenly were coming out really easy when we did repairability tests, but on the plywood, it was fine. So maybe it's different on the type of material it is and the thickness of it. But the nails, I could pull the nails out by hand by the time I hit 5 roofs.
You think that was could that be in a delamination issue or something like that, where the OSB or the CDX was actually weakened as well, or is that
literally what we're saying? Yeah. So the OSB was weakened, and so the nails they didn't have the grip force anymore. If the wood structure around the nail is not very tight anymore because you hit roughly the same area with the nails over and over and over again, it's a problem. But there's no research to point to.
So here's another Pandora's box. Are you talking fortified now? Because there's a lot of leak barrier in fortified, right? Yeah. So here's the other Pandora's box that gets open. Every single manufacturer has a disclaimer in their leak barriers that there can be a chemical reaction between dissimilar materials. So if you put, one manufacturer and then you put in your second layer, because clearly you're not going to be able to pull that off. I mean, that's the whole point of leak barrier, is that it sticks to the decking. You can't pull it off without damaging the decking. But code allows you an additional layer, which means you can go 2 but not 3, right? So if it's there, but as soon as you put a second layer on, depending on the manufacturer, and they all have disclaimers, if there's a chemical reaction that occurs between those, that's not a manufacturing defect. So now it's up to the liability of the contractor to say, all right, is that going to start leaking or not? Because there could be a chemical reaction. And if you've ever seen this, it just drips down.
The dripping black.
That's the dripping black stuff.
That's from a chemical reaction between the shingles.
Between dissimilar leak barriers. Yeah. So now you're back to a code issue, because code requires you to put what? Compatible materials on the roof. So if you're just throwing a dart and saying, God, I hope this doesn't react with each other, that's a liability issue for the contractor, not the homeowner or the carrier. So now with your fortified roof systems that have leak barrier literally everywhere on the seams of the plywood and all penetration and everything, now you've got compatibility issues that's on the shoulders of every single contractor that's putting a second layer of leak barrier on top of that existing.
I didn't know that. That's amazing.
It's a Pandora's box, though, because now you're like,
sense.
oh, now what?
I mean, we know about the metallurgy between different types of metals reacting with each other. I had no idea the asphalt shingles would act differently.
It's not the
with
shingles;
asphalt
it's the leak barrier.
It's the leak.
The
So
leak
it's the
barrier
ice and
itself
water
will
is
turn
the-
to goop and just
Okay.
start dripping down the front. So it's
Yeah.
one leak barrier on top of the other, and the one turns to liquid and just starts running off the roof.
You're right. Yeah. Okay. And it ends up and it stains gutters and does all kinds of crap. And everybody talks about what the hell is this?
Yep.
I've even had people say that it was a problem with the manufacturer, but no, that makes a hell of a lot more sense.
Oh yeah.
Is it because of the different
So here's
SBS type stuff that's in them, or what is the chemical reaction?
okay. So it could be any number of things. So if you look at the tech bulletins behind Grace, for example, Grace is kind of like that's the Cadillac of them. They have more disclaimers for just the roof, the wood species. Can't put it on this. Can't put it on this. Can't put it on this. Can't put it on this because it causes it to turn into liquid. It liquefies it. Now that's one of them that's very picky when you start putting like a GAF or a CertainTeed on top of it. Now CertainTeed had a bunch of issues. The first time I noticed it was CertainTeed made it very clear in their Shingle Master booklet that if you're starting to mix their leak barrier with somebody else's, that is not a manufacturing defect, and there is no coverage for the chemical reaction that would occur. Then GAF came out with it. Now, OC's been a little bit more tricky about it. They just say if you look at the installation instructions on their leak barrier, it says it has to be done on a clean deck. Nowhere does OC ever mention anything about putting or installing their leak barrier on top of leak barrier. And I think that's the reason that's their out, because if it turns into goop because it's reacting with what's existing, and it starts running down the fascia, they're like, wait a second, our installation clearly states you have to install this on a clean deck.
That's crazy.
Every other manufacturer specifically notes the leaching, the leaking that can happen from dissimilar materials with their leak barriers.
But the code allows you to leave leak barrier behind if it starts tearing the decking up when you're removing it. The only layer that you're allowed to leave behind when getting down to the deck.
Code specifically says if you cannot remove that layer without damaging the decking, you may apply an additional layer. That's how it's stated in
But
code.
it doesn't necessarily say.
But they don't
But it
know
still has
about
to be
dissimilar.
compatible.
Yeah, but it still says it has to be compatible, but nobody knows.
Right.
Now, I've got a contractor in Minnesota on the back on the south side of their building. They
Yeah.
put like 20 different, compatibilities. So they put one on top of one on the other, and they use like 8 different kinds.
Yeah.
Guess how many of them are leaking within 5 years? They literally dripping down the face because they did all these. They have different samples. They have about 20 different samples cost from all different combinations of leak barriers. About half of them. Half of them are already dripping because you put one company on top of another and it adds them.
That's crazy.
See how much fun we can have when we're together?
Learning some stuff. Here's my advice for the day. Ask the code enforcement officer to come out and take a look.
Yeah.
Give his own opinion in writing.
Yeah,
That's my little tidbit of the day.
yeah. And if you see inside of the What's That Roofing Code, that is really the spirit of that Facebook group. You will see me come on and say, this is a great time to engage the code official because you know what? Every code official that I've ever worked with appreciate that relationship because, again, they're not reading the Bible of roofing that comes from the GAF and the CertainTeed and the OC.
Yeah.
Like, you can literally help them understand roofing assemblies. They like that. And so you can create friends very, very quickly, but engaging a code official is A1 on my list of what a roofing contractor should be doing on a daily basis today.
I learned a lot of stuff in this conversation. I hope people watch this. Before we let you go, I want to talk to you a little bit about our sponsors, and I've got a quick video for you to see about ink payments.
Accessing your insurance proceeds after a property claim is approved should be fast and easy. Who has time to run around for check endorsements, fill out confusing paperwork, or stay in regular contact with the mortgage company to ensure timely disbursements? That's why there's Ink Payments. Ink Payments allows you to digitally endorse multi-party checks and direct funds to restoration professionals in seconds. Just snap a picture of the check, upload it to Ink, provide a few details, and we'll take care of the rest. Ink.
It's freaking cool. I'm geeking out about weird shit over here.
I love
That's
it.
Ink Payments. They are one of our sponsors. We're actually going to have Ken Lawler from Ink on a show very, very soon, where we're actually going to start talking about some potential issues that they've had complaints about and what's actually going on behind the scenes. So we can see what's going on in there because Ink is on top of their shit. Claim Titan is a PA software for, or PA CRM, a CRM for PAs. If you guys are dealing with claims as a public adjuster, you need a good system that is able to track all your stuff. If you're not using a system at all, what is wrong with you? You have to keep on top of that shit. You even have to keep records for a certain amount of time. Building Experts Institute is the school that Mike is going to be talking about building codes at. You can see why he's the guy we're getting involved for that. He's the expert. So at Building Experts Institute, you can get in there for $100, $9 a month, and we have Xactimate certification training, part of that same membership. You can't get it that price anywhere else. Xactimate level 1, 2, and 3. By the end of this month, we'll all be there. Hook Agency for roofing contractors is about the best marketing agency or marketing firm you can get. They're so good, they convinced me to get a tattoo at our roofing convention. American Policyholder Association is an association that is defeating insurer fraud, meaning insurance fraud committed by insurance carriers. So they are investigating and prosecuting against those. There has been a lot of talk about people saying that there's not a lot going on. I can promise you behind the scenes, talking about accusing someone of fraud, you have to be right. There is a lot of investigating still going on. There is a lot of work happening. So bear in mind, there's a lot that you don't see. American Policyholder Association is doing a ton. And then there's the Huggins Law Firm, probably the best law firm on the planet. Definitely the best for Georgia and Florida.
Hey, Matt, we're fighting some O&L issues right now in Georgia and Florida, and I want to circle back on this topic. And hopefully 6 months from now, we'll have some conclusions or case law, to those fights. But I want to say this: if Mike and Matt are doing a class at Building Experts Institute, I don't care, contractor, public adjuster, attorney, you need to check it out. I sat down with Matt just a couple months ago, and all we talked about was O&L, and literally applied it to one of my cases the next day and got it paid. So, as you can see, Mike's got a wealth of knowledge. Fee? Yep. So I'm being honest. Hey, if you're a contractor, a public adjuster, an IA, an attorney, whatever it might be, get in on that class. You're going to learn something, and it's going to help you out. It's an investment.
Awesome. And one last thing for Listen to This Bull, we do a webinar once a month. Coming up this Friday is the Cut Through the BS, Defeating Bad Hail and Wind Claim Denials. It's an 8-hour class on Zoom. It's only $650. You guys need to take a look at that. It is on my Facebook page. So look up my name, Matthew. So the only one to you, Matthew Mulholland. Take a look at that. This Friday, it will help you win the claims. That's it. We will see you next Tuesday.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
See ya.
You are wearing a ridiculous thing.